In Chapter 3 of our text, we discuss the very important concept of curriculum. And what you're going to notice throughout this chapter is that there's a conflict between standard-based reform and the middle school concept. But the argument is this, that student-focused education is essential even when standards are present. And that's going to be something that we'll continue to investigate in this chapter. So what initiated standards-based reform? Well, it really came about from a government impetus from the report, A Nation at Risk, which was published in 1983, which showed American students to be very far behind European counterparts in terms of their test-taking capabilities. And this was reported via international tests that were given to certain samples of students in the United States. And they were just performing much lower than both European and Asian counterparts. So, the thought was we've got to better prepare these students to be competitive in a global society. So the Department of Education started offering more funding and money to school districts throughout the United States who would adopt certain standards and assessments to prepare students to succeed in college and the workplace. This started out with the No Child Left Behind policy under the Bush presidency, and then continued on with the Obama administration to race to the top. So not only do they need to adopt standards and assessments that are aligned to these standards, they need to build data systems that measure student growth and success. And these data systems are not just for giving a summative evaluation of how students are performing, but it also informs teachers and principals of where gaps might lie, where strengths are currently at, and it gives them valuable information for improving instruction. In addition, they need to show that they are recruiting, developing, rewarding, and retaining effective teachers and principals, especially where they are needed most. And they need to demonstrate that they are turning around the lowest performing schools within their district. So schools that adopt these 4 different criteria, they're awarded more money, more federal grant money for continuing to improve their programs. That is all part of the Race to the Top initiative, which is still underway. And if you check out the notes portion of my PowerPoint presentation, I give you a little story about differing feelings about the Race to the Top initiatives. It's just there to give you some food for thought and to give you an insider look at how different school systems feel about this initiative. So while the standards-based reform came about because of American students' lower performance on international standardized tests, and it was very important to note that these measures showed that U.S. students were below at every level, K through 12. And so politicians really were at the foundation of the impetus for the standards-based reform. But the problem is they're politicians, they're not educators. So there have been many criticisms that have come about because of the way standards-based reform has been implemented. And we really do need to reach some middle ground. But I want to address some of these criticisms, and they are offered on pages 87 through 92 of your text. George and Alexander start out by saying many of the standards have become irrelevant in terms of they do not prepare students for life in the real world. They're bored to death because the standards lack relevance and they do not have real world ties. They also believe that there are inaccurate charges of mediocrity. What am I saying here? Well, even though students did not perform as high as their European and Asian counterparts in math and English language arts, your Asian countries have yet to produce a Mark Zuckerberg or a Steve Jobs. One area where American students have always thrived and shined is in the area to be creative. We have produced very successful entrepreneurs, and that has come about because we have valued creativity. And that creativity has shined in classrooms where teachers were afforded academic freedom to create curricula, programs, activities, and assessments. based around students' interests and needs. The other problem with standards-based reformed is so test driven that the accountability measures are so harsh. If you don't meet this certain cut score, this benchmark, you will lose funding, you could lose your job, students won't graduate. So teachers are then just teaching to the test. And again, students then become bored to death. Because the standards were implemented pretty fast, many teachers have not had the training that they need to learn how to incorporate them in ways where they can still have student-centered curricula, and they have just not had the professional development that they need in order to continue to teach in a way where it responds to students' interests and needs while still meeting standards. It's been a one or the other, but not both. And students, who are the ones who should be receiving a better education, are bored to death. So in some ways, critics argue that standards-based reform is punishing the very victim. We should be making their education better, more stimulating, more interesting, and yet they are just extremely bored. Then you have teachers who are saying, listen, American schools are supposed to be democratic. Yes, we should have certain benchmarks we should meet, but they shouldn't be so stringent where there's no choice anymore in what we're teaching. And we should be able to craft our curricula to respond to local needs. That's part of what American society has always been based on. So some charge that it's very anti-democratic. Furthermore, because the standards are so stringent and textbooks are written to the standards, teachers do not feel that they can just employ research and best practices and pedagogy that's responsive to their students' needs. They feel that they have been tracked into using certain methodology to teach a certain way, and that runs counter to educational research. And these are all valid. The issue now becomes, how can we take standard-based reforms and mold them into an integrated curricula, which is the best fit for a middle school classroom in a way that is responsive to the needs and interests of students who are in a very transitional and important and delicate place in their life. So how can middle school teachers bridge the divide between standards-based reformed and an integrated curricula? Well, one effective means is through curriculum mapping. And we are going to construct our own curriculum map in our first performance-based project. And you're given a template, and most states have like a template that they encourage their faculty to use, or even school districts themselves have their own. And I have one that I think is very effective for helping you to get those standards, align activities that meet student needs, and then making sure that those are also in alignment with both formative and summative assessment so that everything can be incorporated. It can be done. What it takes is effective planning at the forefront. So curriculum mapping is one way to do this. These are not nitty-gritty lesson plans. These are big idea, overarching frameworks for what you would like to accomplish and the main activities that you will use to teach certain skills, to reach certain standards, and the ways that you will formatively and summatively assess. But they are not the nitty-gritty day-to-day lesson plans. There are some different definitions that I think you should be familiar with in terms of curriculum, because there's different curricula. There's the explicit. This would be your map. This would also be any other plans that would help you to fulfill that curricula. This is what appears in teachers' plans in documentation that is provided to the principal and available to the superintendent. It's explicit, it's evident. Then there's the implicit or hidden curriculum. And this has to do with how particular assumptions about schooling and learning is made manifest in practice. For example, when a teacher has his or her desk at the front of the classroom and teaches from this area, the message that is being learned by students is that the teacher is in control, included being the font of all knowledge and the center of attention. The teacher is also the individual who makes all of the decisions. Another example involves the value of particular topics that is communicated implicitly. Such values can be communicated by the time spent, by the tone of the teacher's voice, or by how the topic is treated. Is it trivialized or marginalized, or is extra emphasis given to it? So that's the implicit or hidden curricula. It's not made evident in writing or documentation, but it is made evident in tone and treatment. Then there's the null curriculum, and this is important to address because it is what is not taught. So you might have an explicit curricula where something is documented and it says it's going to be taught, but there's a lot of different reasons why something may not be taught. Maybe it's that the educator does not have the knowledge that they should in order to teach it, so they skip it. Maybe time wasn't available to reach a certain topic. Maybe there are deeply ingrained assumptions and biases that cause a teacher to not want to teach something. For instance, teachers in schools may not teach that Christopher Columbus slaughtered many of the native peoples he encountered when he discovered the Americas. Some private schools do not teach about evolution, even though it's in mandate standards. They make different choices. So those are three different types of curricula, and it's important to know that even though you might have an explicit curricula there, because of the implicit curricula or null curricula, not everything that is explicitly written is actually taught. So when you're creating a curriculum map, you want to consider several important things. You want to consider student needs and interests. You also want to consider adult concerns. So when you're developing thematic units or mini courses, soliciting parent feedback and input is important. And you can do that through sending home a parent letter with some different options for mini courses, asking what is the most important thing for you? What do you think resonates most with your students' needs and interests? That helps build community, and it also assures that parental support will be available at home. But then you also have to tie these into the curriculum standards. So having some background information and input on student needs, interests, and parental concerns, and then connecting those with curriculum standards is a great place to get started. Once you have that in alignment, you can come up with activities that fit both the curriculum standards and the students' needs, interests, and parental concerns. And then you have to make sure that you tie your assessment and evaluation means to the activities and standards. Everything needs to be in thorough alignment. This is a big task, and again, even though we're going to be creating a map for a fictitious student body, so you're not going to really know your students' needs, interests, and concerns, you're going to make some assumptions based on what you know so far about middle school students and what some general needs would be. But usually you have to implement something and then you take some time to assess it and refine it. Because what you may find out is the first go around that your timelines are off, that it took longer or it took less time to go through a certain mini course. And timing is very, very important. So it takes some practice in order to get it perfect. But in addition, there are so many completed curriculum maps already out there, and we can learn from what other practitioners have already put into motion by going over curriculum maps that have been already implemented. You do also, once you make your map, you want to look for gaps. Look for gaps between an activity and the assessment method. Are you really assessing what you have had the students put into practice, or is there some misalignment there? So you want to make sure everything is streamlined. If you read the notes portion of this slide, you'll see that I give you 6 different thorough tasks that you would want to go through when you're curriculum mapping. Some of these aren't going to be obviously applicable to the project that we'll be doing because you need to put it into practice, but I do think that they might become very practical and useful for you once you're in a school system and involved in curriculum mapping. So they would be worthwhile looking at. I'm going to wrap up this presentation with a brief discussion of the Common Core state standards. I've really only covered the first portion of the chapter, and the reason I don't want to get into it anymore is you're going to be reading about some different interdisciplinary approaches starting on page 102, and then you pick one of those in order to model your first performance-based project after. And so I think the reading in and of itself will be enough for you. But the Common Core state standards, sometimes I feel like they do get a bad rap because maybe they were initially politically motivated, but we have to remember that educators and educational researchers and practitioners were involved with their creation. And they really do provide a consistent and clear understanding of what students are expected to learn so that teachers and parents know what they need to do to help them. The issue is just making sure that teachers are well informed about the standards and about best practices for teaching to standards, and that they bridge that gap so that parents feel that they can best support their children in accomplishing these standards. These standards are robust. They are relevant to the real world. Initially, there was the feeling that they were not, but they do have relevance because the intention is to prepare children to be college and career ready. And part of the issue just becomes teachers needing to find different ways to integrate them with real world application. I would like you to take some time to visit the Common Core standards page to look at which states have adopted this reform and to consider some of the ways that they are driving instruction. You'll be using the Common Core state standards, and or you may also use the next generation science standards if need be, depending on the interdisciplinary approach that you choose and the content areas that you choose for your first performance-based project. So the Common Core state standards are primarily written for mathematics and then also for English language arts. And then the next generation science ones are those that have been adopted primarily for science. And then for social studies, we'll use Ohio standards. Not all of you are going to use the social studies standards because not all of you are going to create an interdisciplinary curriculum map or mini courses or thematic workshops that have social studies applications. But if you do, those would be the standards that you employ. At any rate, when you get into that first performance-based project, you are going to have a thorough description provided to you, and you'll be given websites to go to gather standards that would be relevant to the projects that you design. And that's all under the first performance-based project folder. So don't worry about that right now, but I would like you to go ahead and to check out the Common Core state standards and to think about how they're going to impact your instruction. And even think about, because many of you were taught under Common Core state standards, how did you find that they were influencing your own teacher's instruction in both positive and negative ways?